Special Green Builder Media webinar. There is no witty or clever observation today. It's the anniversary of September 11th. It's a somber commemoration for all who remember that tragic day. And another variation from the usual open is that we'd like you to answer two poll questions, one that we had right there at the beginning, and one that's going to come up prior to our Q&A session. So stay tuned for that. Now, while you ponder your poll question and your feedback, and also the one that's coming up, there's our first one there. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests that are here to tell us about the new upsides and perks that come with sprinkler installs. Now, our first panelist is Lorraine Carley. She is the president of the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition and vice president of outreach and advocacy for the National Fire Protection Association, where she oversees media, public affairs, and advocacy activities, the organization's magazine, which is called NFPA Journal, and the NFPA's Wildfire, Public Education, and U.S.-Canada Regional Operations Divisions. Now, she is joined today by Gary Keith, the HFSC past president. Gary served as vice president of field operations for NFPA, overseeing 6 divisions responsible for the outreach of NFPA's fire safety mission. He also served as his hometown community for 20 years as a call firefighter and fire protection engineer with the West Bridgewater, Massachusetts Fire Department. And rounding out our panel is Bob Sullivan, NFPA Southwest Regional Director. He assists with code adoptions, legislative advocacy, training, public education, and stakeholder engagement in the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Now, Bob has over 31 years of experience serving on fire departments in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Colorado. And prior to working at NFPA, he served on the Thornton Fire Department in Colorado, where he focused on new development, construction, and fire code enforcement. Now, this webinar, as you might suspect, is being brought to you by the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition, which is a nonprofit educational organization and the leading resource for independent, non-commercial information about home fire sprinklers. HFSC offers free educational resources about installed home fire sprinklers to consumers, members of the fire service, the home building industry, water purveyors, and other stakeholders. Many of HFSC's educational programs have been funded through FEMA fire prevention and safety grants. Now, you can always submit questions for our guests on these webinars, you know that. Simply use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll review those questions and pose those to our panelists during the Q&A time set aside after the discussion and, like I said, after that second poll. Now, facilitating the discussion today is co-founder of Green Builder Media and the Green Builder himself, Ron Jones. Ron, good to see you again, my friend.
Good to see you, Mike. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here on this, as you related, a somber but important day in American history. And I think it's appropriate to be talking about the topic today with people who know more about it than just about anyone. So I look forward to the information that we're going to share. And we'll just step right in there and welcome Lorraine Carley. Lorraine, it's all yours.
Thanks, Ron. Nice to be here with you and with the rest of the panel. What I thought I would do is just open up our webinar this afternoon by providing some little context on today's fire problem. Today's fires in 1- and 2-family homes are more dangerous to residents and firefighters, and I'm not sure that that fact is that well known. So wanted to share some information from NFPA research. 6 people die in a home fire every day. 53% of firefighter injuries are from fighting house fires. In firefighters, they have a 14% increase in cancer-related deaths compared to the general population in the US. You know, if we think about today, unfortunately, being the anniversary of 9/11, we are seeing so many of those post 9/11 cancer deaths. Same for any large exposure to fire. And home fires in 1- and 2-family cause 8.6 billion direct property damage. Now, home fire death rates have actually increased over the years. We've seen some of the different types of buildings where those numbers have gone down, but what we see on the home fire front is that they have actually gone up since the 1980s. One of the scariest facts that I often talk about is that if you have a reported home fire today, you're more likely to die than you were 40 years ago. Now that's, today we say that fires can become deadly in less than 2 minutes. We used to say that you'd have about 7, 8, or even 10 minutes to escape a home fire. That's very different today because of the way we build homes and the things that are in them. Common synthetic furnishings burn hotter and faster than natural materials of years ago, and they produce this toxic, deadly smoke. We're also seeing the impact of emerging technologies such as lithium-ion batteries that are powering so much of everything in our lives. Lightweight construction material is very good in the building industry, but we do know that it burns faster and fails quicker, often collapsing in a fire. And also those large, more open designs enable for quicker flashover because of the airflow that's in those types of homes. Now, 2 minutes is not a lot of time to escape a fire. You may think that, I go out of my house every single day, I'd know how to get out quickly. But when we think about that toxic smoke, also people that might be at a higher risk, small children, older adults, people with disabilities, needing more time to escape. Now, smoke alarms are great and they're essential in all homes. They warn you that there's smoke. But the heat from fire actually activates the sprinkler closest to the fire. You see that diagram there that shows how a sprinkler works. The concealed fire sprinkler, the plate falls off at about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That bulb in the middle at about 135 to 165, the bulb bursts and starts to release the water. The fire sprinkler stops a fire from becoming deadly, giving people that extra time to escape. And often we see in the movies that all the sprinklers going off at once. The reality is typically only one sprinkler activates and controls or keeps that fire small in a home fire. Now, home fire sprinklers are very important because they stop a fire from becoming deadly. They control a fire automatically, often extinguishing it before the fire department arrives. And it also is very important that it protects firefighters from that exposure of the fire, toxic gases. You can see this side-by-side comparison in these pictures with the living room that is fire protected with home fire sprinklers on the left and one without, a vast difference in the scenario. Now, we also have some new research that we got from UL's Fire Safety Research Institute that was looking at the impact of residential fire sprinklers during e-mobility device requirements in fires. We see these with e-bikes and e-scooters and all of these types of devices. They have consistently observed that while the room where the fire was originally was damaged, the sprinklers did not allow the flame spread to secondary items and ultimately prevented flashover. That's the point in which everything in the room gets so hot that it ignites. So we're very excited about the fact that we now have information saying that fire sprinklers will be beneficial as we see more and more of these e-mobility devices. In fact, a couple of news stories recently, one in Maryland, one in Arizona, where the lithium-ion battery fire was actually extinguished by the sprinklers. We also know that home fire sprinklers protect the environment, and that's important to a lot of people. The green movement is certainly very strong, and people are paying a lot of attention to the environment. We did research a couple of years ago, back in 2010, but we had it reaffirmed just a couple of years ago on the environmental impact of fires, and find that sprinklers can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 98%. Fire damage by up to 97%, water usage to fight a fire by as much as 91%, and water pollution. So some really strong statistics in support of the environmental benefits of sprinklers. And lastly, we know that home buyers want to live in fire-safe homes. We did some research with the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition that found that 86% of current homeowners say fire safety is important as they look to buy a new home. 72% of those surveyed believe sprinklers add value to a home. And 80% of millennials would prefer to buy a home with fire sprinklers after learning how they worked.
Lorraine, thank you so much. It's amazing how much compelling information you have around the importance of this issue. And to take us into the world of the developer and show us how it can be beneficial from the other side of the table, welcome to Gary Keith.
Thank you, Ron. It's great to be here with everybody today. I'm going to focus on the actual developer incentives that we've utilized across the country. I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies here in Massachusetts where I'm based. But before I do that, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on talking about the installation standard, which is called NFPA 13D. The D actually stands for domestic when the standard was originally created in the 70s. And it's really focused on preventing injury and life loss. There really isn't a property protection requirement or threshold within the standard, but we know through experience in this document now being around for almost 50 years that we're seeing an inherent benefit to property loss through the installations of sprinklers. There's a 10-minute water supply requirement, as Lorraine talked about with the sprinklers not all activating. We only require sprinklers to be installed in the living areas. Does not require sprinklers in garages or attic spaces, small rooms, less than 55 square feet, such as bathrooms and closets and pantries. I will admit to you on garages, there are a number of jurisdictions around the country that have made local amendments requiring garages to be sprinkled. And we actually may see the standard look at this issue a little bit in more detail, particularly because of the use of energy storage systems and electric vehicle charging, which those two things often take place within the garage. So you may see sprinklers included in the standard, but as of today, it is not required. There are two types of sprinkler layouts. CPVC is usually used for standalone plumbing systems. I retrofitted my house over 20 years ago, and I have a standalone CPV system for that. And that predominantly is what we see or have seen since the standard was created. I would say now, though, we do see an increase in multi-purpose or PEX systems, and those are combined with the cold water plumbing. So you take the sprinkler head itself, and you'll have multiple ports with 4 or 5 PEX pieces of tubing going into that sprinkler. And the thing is under constant flow, and there's no issues with standing water or anything like that. We're connected to the domestic water supply. We do not need separate water mains. We do have issues in some areas of the country with water authorities who are used to the concept of a commercial sprinkler system where that has an independent separate main coming in from the street. That's not a requirement within NFPA 13D. Again, I was able to utilize my existing lead-in and just did a break off the domestic piping on the lead-in and connected my residential sprinkler system to that. If there is no public water supply available, then a tank and pump can be utilized. Again, you only need about 200 gallons. We're talking about a design of about of 2 sprinklers flowing about 10 gallons a minute, and in a short period of time, 10 minutes, you're going to use about 200 gallons of water, about the size of an oil storage tank. We get issues and concerns about maintenance. And again, my system has been in place for more than 20 years. I've done more maintenance and replacement of components on my smoke alarm system than I've done with anything with the sprinkler system. The simple flow test is recommended a couple of times a year. The consumer can do that themselves. It's not hard. There's a drain valve at the end of the system, and that can be opened up. May have to have a hose connected to it if it doesn't have a direct connection to the outside, but it's not a lot of heavy lifting. And then just visual inspection as you would with any system or component in your home. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with codes, but I just want to, again, affirm the fact that home fire sprinklers have been in the codes, both the national codes, both the NFPA and the ICC building and fire codes, for more than 15 years now. And we have 2 states that have introduced mandates. They've had them now for about 10 years. That's California and Maryland. And unfortunately, many states and local jurisdictions have made amendments to remove those from those baseline codes, if you will. And so when the code promulgation process occurs, unfortunately, the code bodies have removed this provision, and it's been unfortunate. And that's really a part of this, why we're doing this webinar today, is because in lieu of that situation, we're looking for opportunities to increase usage outside of the codes, and that's why we want to talk about incentives. So the key point with incentives is really to reduce the construction costs and increase builder and developer profits whenever we can. And these are locally negotiated trade-ups. The ones I'm going to talk about don't have to be applied every single time and can't be applied really on every single project, but at least they can be talked about. We do have communities that actually will make some of these incentives part of their zoning regulations, if you will, locally, outside of the building code, but they'll do it as part of a zoning bylaw or something like that. But authorities having jurisdiction can offer sprinklers when they're not in the codes, and that's what we're trying to do. And admittedly, outside of California and Maryland, we probably see more installations now done through this developer incentive process around the country than we do see through the code process. Each community is different, and when you don't have a code in place that says thou shalt sprinkler every new home, then the downside is you have to have the discussion with every development as it moves forward. But that's okay, because they're different, we can apply these incentives in a different way with each project. And the key point is we're protecting the occupants and the firefighters. Go back to those statistics that Lorraine talked about, and the fact that we're trying to protect the occupants and the firefighters responding to those incidents. So we have 9 developer incentives that we have seen most used in different parts of the country. I'm going to run through these very quickly. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, and I'll just try to reflect on what's the thought process and how it relates to fire department response. Obviously, with street width reduction and developments, we can see narrower streets, and the key point here is we're talking about the fire department response. We expect in a sprinklered property that the fire department response will be much less than a necessary response will be much less than if that property was not sprinkled. So in a typical residential fire that we expect a room to go to flash over and extend perhaps beyond that original room of origin to other portions of the home, the typical fire department response is probably going to be 6 or 7 pieces of heavy apparatus. And with sprinklers, we can expect a much lower response necessary in terms of the amount of equipment that's needed to respond to that incident. So therefore, we don't need to have the street width requirements to take care of all that apparatus that might be necessarily an unsprinkled property. Longer dead-end streets. Again, we can allow longer dead-end streets because of the fact that we can minimize the fact that we're going to have the amount of congestion, again, with a fire department response. So we can allow for the fact with that sprinkled property, we can have a longer access for fire departments to be able to take care of that incident. And a longer dead-end street is a common approach to these type of developments. T-turnarounds. Some areas of the country, we'll call them hammerhead turnarounds. Instead of a large cul-de-sac or a large circular drive that might be necessary to turn around fire apparatus, we can utilize T-turnarounds again. Because again, we only expect a much smaller fire department response, fewer pieces of equipment in that development when a fire occurs. Increased street grades and setbacks. This is a very common one. If you have a steep grade into development or to a number of homes within that development, or you have large, long setbacks, long driveways, sprinklers are a common incentive to be used to be able to offset that situation and to assist the fire department and be able to control that fire without them having to lay long lines of hose to get into that setback, or to minimize the effect of a large grade and the negative effect that would have on a large fire department response with their apparatus. Single access points. Now, this is one we've used in my area of the country here in Massachusetts several times. And admittedly, in an area where it's prone to wildfires, this is probably one that wouldn't be attractive in many cases because of the conditions with evacuation and wildfires. But in areas where wildfires are not a concern, eliminating a secondary access for emergency response is a popular incentive that we've seen used very frequently. Additional units permitted and higher density. And again, another very popular one. This is one that really set the groundwork for the adoption in California. California, on a statewide basis, looked at increasing the density, allowable density for residential developments as a requirement, as a part of the requirement for statewide sprinklers in new homes. And we see this in a lot of other developments as well. I'll talk about it in one of the case studies that I have. And again, the idea being that you're going to control that fire in that single unit, and so therefore the density can be increased as a result of that. This is another big one. The expansion of the existing water supply may not be needed. So in a sprinkler development, the water flow can be calculated, the necessary water flow can be calculated just on the domestic demand alone. So if you have a new development and the public water supply has to be extended into that development beyond where it currently is, if that sprinkler system is not installed in these new homes, and then a fire flow calculation has to be done for what the fire department would need to control a fire in that dwelling. And the fire flow requirement is going to be much larger in an unsprinkled home than a sprinkled home. So therefore, the flow requirement when you extend that water supply is going to be much higher than what would be required if that development was sprinkled. And so the demand for the expansion of that water supply can strictly be calculated on the domestic flow, and that domestic flow will take care of the sprinkler demand for the sprinkler system. So one of the fallacies we hear about is, well, wait a minute, we don't have the water supply to be able to provide sprinklers. We have a very limited water supply in the area. Well, that's an incentive then to be using the sprinklers to take advantage of that, because you only need a limited water supply to be able to meet the demand of the sprinklers. Increased hydrant spacing, again, this is another one, and the theory behind this one is simply you don't need all that infrastructure because the fire department isn't going to make use of it. So we can increase the spacing between hydrants. In most developments, we see a spacing requirement of anywhere from 250 to 500 feet, and that can be increased. I've seen increases up to 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet, basically based on the whatever the hose bed in the truck will store for hose. That becomes then the requirement in a sprinkler development. So much less infrastructure in terms of when the system gets installed, the public water supply, much fewer hydrants have to be maintained in that system. Gated communities, again, you know, this is another incentive, and it may not sound like it much. Obviously, the fire department is going to have some sort of access code or swipe key or something like that. But in terms of the fact that a fire increases exponentially as it grows, then any slowdown, so, you know, having to slow down that piece of fire apparatus to enter an access code or swipe a card or whatever it might be for that gate to move aside so the fire department can enter, that's going to slow up their response. So the sprinklers can help mitigate that they're already activating when the fire department is responding and controlling that fire. So we don't have to worry about access as much in a gated community. So I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies, and Massachusetts is one of several states around the country where we are a mini max state, meaning that the state code is both the minimum and the maximum within the state. So no local jurisdictions can deviate from that code. They cannot make local options to amend the code, either take provisions out, or in the case of sprinklers, amend those provisions in. And so you say, well, how can we possibly get sprinklers installed anywhere here in Massachusetts? And we've been doing this through the planning process. So again, we cannot pass a local regulation anywhere in Massachusetts that says all new homes will be sprinkled. Unlike California and Maryland that I talked about earlier that have the statewide provision, They got to that point after many, many years of local adoptions, and the local communities were very successful with this across those 2 states. And at the state level, people said, well, wait a minute, this has been so successful for so many years locally, let's just do it statewide. And that's what they've been doing for over 10 years now. But the mini-max states like Massachusetts, we can't do that. So we have to go through the planning process, and that's what we're doing now, is trying to work with planning boards and zoning boards and look at on a case-by-case, on a development by development basis, to look at how can we use these incentives to get sprinklers installed. So we're a very small town here, but nonetheless, we've had 2 developments, one called The Farm and one called Pearl Road, with about a little over 50 houses. And we used single access. We eliminated that need for the second access road. We extended the dead end road requirements, and we increased the hydrant spacing. The original incentive for installing both these properties was the fact that they were the furthest response area for the fire department. It was about a 7 or 8 minute response time to get to this area of the town. That was the initial motivation in talking with the developer. And the developer fought the planning board initially on the first project because it was something new to the developer, and they had never done this before. But nonetheless, they agreed because of the incentives that were put on the table that overall ended up with a couple extra home lots, as well as the infrastructure savings with the eliminating the second access road and the eliminating the additional hydrants. It was the same developer for the second project, and by the time we got to that, the developer never even came to the public hearing, and he was quoted as saying to the fire chief after the first development, "This was great. We used the fact that the property was sprinkled in our marketing material, and that was very successful, and they were very happy with the way it went and didn't even come to the public hearing for the second project." The Hopkinton experience is a very interesting one and a much more recent one. And, you know, Hopkinton is a town in Metro West section of Massachusetts, west of Boston. And they added over 1,000 units in a very short period of time in within these 2 developments, Legacy Farms and the Trails. I mean, that's a big chunk of development for a town like Hopkinton. And they're not required to be sprinkled as part of the building code, state building code, again, mini-max code here in Massachusetts. But through this community risk program, they looked at how they could provide sprinklers as part of this incentive. The old approach would have been probably in this area of Hopkinton would have been to add another fire station. And at the end of the day, you know, that does not get you the same level of risk reduction that having these sprinklers does. So how was this done? It was done with a community agreement with the 2 developers involved in these 2 projects. And interestingly enough, in the last couple of years, there have been 3 fires since these homes were first put in. So already we've had success stories. Every one of those 3 fires, they were contained to the area of origin by 1 sprinkler. All fires were found to be extinguished prior to the fire department arriving. And I will admit to you that the design philosophy of NFP 13D with residential sprinklers is not necessarily extinguishment, it's control. Is it keep that fire small, maintain the egress path, the integrity of the egress path for the occupants to escape, keep the fire small until the fire department gets there. But in these fires, and as in many fires, we see that the system actually extinguishes the fire. No injuries or death, which again is the benchmark for how we're trying to get sprinklers installed. So really a community risk success. And I'm going to look now at a couple of these, one of these fires of the 3 in comparison to one that was not sprinkled within Hopkinton. So both homes were under construction at the time with a move-in date within that same weekend, and the second one was not far behind. Both of them were improper disposal of oily rags. They were doing some wood finishing. The sprinkler home, we had again 1 sprinkler activated and controlled the fire. In the unsprinkled home, it was a total loss that to this day is still vacant, while the developer and the insurance company and the potential homeowner wait for a final outcome and resolution about all the issues that go along with having a total loss fire. So the first one in the new construction was on the 13th of April, a couple of years ago. This was a duplex, new construction. Again, the oily rags was still unoccupied, so there was no one there to extinguish the fire, but the sprinkler system was in service. We had that sprinkler activated. This is an actual photo from the area where the fire occurred. And then compare that to one that happened just a couple of days later, 3 days later. New 2.5-story home, under construction, same thing, oily rags, total loss, still unoccupied today. And the quote from the fire chief, this particular fire did not have sprinklers. We highly encourage residential sprinklers because they can make a big difference. I don't have a slide for it, but I do want to mention, because we're so proud of it here in Massachusetts, those of us involved in sprinkler advocacy, really the poster child for success here in Massachusetts is the town of North Andover, which is just north of Boston. They've been at this through developer incentives since the 90s, and they now have over 3,000 homes sprinklered here in a mini-max state in Massachusetts, and they also have had a number of success stories. You don't hear about the success stories. That's the unfortunate part, but they're out there every day. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Gary, very well done. Thank you. You know, it's remarkable how many options are available to the development community. And I hope that through this education, more of them will take a hard look at some of those options. The results are undeniable. And I think that we're going to see evidence of that in the next presenter. Welcome to Bob Sullivan, who's going to take us to Nevada.
Hey, thanks, Ron. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our webinar today. So we are going to talk about Nevada. As the regional director for the Southwest Division at NFPA, one of my states that I cover is Nevada, and I work closely with the Las Vegas Fire and Rescue Department. And a couple of years ago, Las Vegas Fire and Rescue was very successful in seeing through the adoption of residential sprinklers in the city. And it was a very interesting story. So that's what we're going to kind of work through today, talking about that whole experience. The thing that really brought this to the attention of the fire department initially was in 2018, Realtor.com identified Las Vegas as the #1 hottest housing market in the United States, with up to 1,700 homes per year projected to be built for the foreseeable future. 1,700 homes per year for at least the next 5 to 10 years at the time that study was done. So that really grabbed a lot of attention in terms of just how quickly Las Vegas is growing. So realizing that they had previously amended residential sprinklers out of the codes, as you heard Lorraine and Gary both mention, talking about the history of the codes and that the requirement for residential sprinklers have actually been in the codes for a while, but they had amended them out for houses less than 5,000 square feet. And so coming into 2018, when they saw the results of this study, that really grabbed the attention of Fire Chief William McDonald, who was previously the fire chief in the city of Scottsdale, Arizona, which had previously adopted residential sprinklers back in the 1980s. And he was working with Fire Marshal Robert Nolan with Las Vegas Fire and Rescue. And looking at that study, looking at the growth of the city, they both determined, okay, what do we got to do to get residential sprinklers back into the code? And how do we move forward to make sure all these new homes are going to be built with sprinkler protection? So they looked at developing a collaborative approach with the people who actually build the buildings, the home builders. We want to have sprinklers be part of a larger strategic vision of overall community risk reduction in the city of Las Vegas. And we realize that we need to engage and develop good working relationships with the home builders associations in Nevada, in Las Vegas. And that's going to involve going and meeting with them and sitting down and discussing all of this and listen to their concerns. So they also looked at, okay, well, how do we establish those relationships in the first place? Let's take a look at working with the home builders on projects that maybe don't involve sprinklers. That's a chance for us to all work together, start getting to know each other, work through plan review issues, inspection issues, things like that. And then let's bring the conversation around to residential sprinklers. And one of the things that the HBA pointed out was, well, we keep talking about new single family homes for residential sprinklers, Are you taking a look at all your existing apartment buildings, for example, in the city that maybe were built, prior to code requirements requiring sprinklers in new apartment buildings? A lot of unsprinkled apartment buildings in the city. There are fires occurring in those buildings. There are injuries and fatalities that are happening there. Are you looking at them also, not necessarily to put sprinklers in, but as part of that community risk reduction overall look at the city of what can we do to reduce this problem? And the fire department started focusing on that as well. Wanted to get sprinklers into the new homes being built, and also took a look at all the existing buildings and how can we do better there. So all this led to this new collaborative approach for working much more closely with the HBA to establish these good working relationships and discuss all these concerns with residential sprinklers. And early on, both the fire chief and the fire marshal took on the opinion of, the fire service and the fire department certainly has concerns about why we want sprinklers in these new homes. Well, the HBA has valid concerns also. After all, they're the ones building the homes, and they're the ones who have to make this all happen when the homes are being put together. So how do we work through their concerns? Obviously, cost has always been brought up, but there are other concerns also. And then again, the concerns that the HBA brought forward about, well, we need to address fire problems in existing unsprinklered buildings also. And so the fire department put new programs in place for those buildings as well, work much more closely with building owners on smoke alarm programs, training for the residents, and things like that. So moving into the meetings directly with the HBA, while it was understood that cost was certainly an issue that always comes into the discussions about residential sprinklers, they were able to sit down and find out, well, there's quite a bit more to it than just the cost aspect. There are other things that go into getting residential sprinklers actually built in the homes. And so among other things, it's a case of, well, it's adding another system to the home. And so now that requires another plan submittal and another review, which is often also going to come with additional requirements for additional permits and field inspections. And then there was a whole conversation around water tap and supply line sizing issues, and what size tap do we need for what size home, and where in the city, depending on where the development's going in, and who can install all these different components, the sprinklers themselves, the water meters when they're involved. Can sprinkler contractors put those in? Can plumbers put those in? What kind of training and certification requirements are required then for each of those different entities, depending on who's actually doing the work? And so from all this collectively, the home builders were able to express adding another system in the homes, residential sprinklers, can really slow down the construction, all of the construction progress, and therefore development of the entire housing division itself. And then of course cost at every step of the way. So all these things were on the table for discussion of, okay, here are the issues we need to address. And then we're able to sit down and work through each of these items one by one. And one of the concerns that the HBA brought up was, 13D has its requirements. We don't want to have additional requirements outside of what the code requires. And so things like talking about sprinklers in garages, sprinklers in attics, sprinklers in small closets. Sprinklers aren't required in any of those areas right now in NFPA 13D. And there were concerns that, we don't want additional requirements added on to what's in the code. Just ask us to comply with what's in the code and leave it at that, not any additions. Now, keep in mind, you heard both Lorraine and Gary talk about the obvious growing problem of lithium-ion batteries today. And keep in mind that all these discussions were going on back in 2017 and 2018, when the lithium-ion battery issue was still fairly new, very new, and we didn't know much about it. And no discussions had yet got to the point of talking about maybe possibilities for requirements for sprinklers in garages, for example. That requirement is still not in the code, but it is being discussed now that the lithium-ion battery issue is growing. You may see that in the future, as Gary mentioned. It's not in there right now, and the HBA's point was, please don't ask us to do something that's not required in the code, because that's what adds time and cost and et cetera. And then along with that, the water supply issue. So especially if a subdivision is being built over an area where elevation changes, for example, then the water tap size may need to be increased in different areas to account for the additional friction loss of additional elevation. So let's figure out where is the highest friction loss issue in the whole subdivision, size the water main tap off of that, and then that way the whole rest of the subdivision should be okay. So in other words, we're gonna have one water tap size across the whole subdivision, as opposed to one tap size over in this area and another tap size over in that area, which can lend itself to cost issues, possibilities for incorrect installation of the wrong size meter in the wrong place, things like that. Let's just make it consistent, get the costs consistent, require one tap size for the entire subdivision. And then they started looking at other things also. Again, don't have add-ons to NFPA 13D. NFPA 13D's main priority is to hold the fire at bay long enough to let the people get out of the house. In most cases, it will also suppress the fire, but the biggest issue is to make sure there's time for the people to get out. So let's not have any requirements for fire department connections like you would on a commercial building, for example, not needed on a smaller single-family home. No requirements for any kind of fire alarm system on the home that's connected to the sprinkler system, so that in case the sprinkler system activates, it would send an alarm signal to the fire department, for example. That particular issue is especially contentious in some areas. You might be talking about homes where people are only there for a few months out of the year. What if something happens where water is flowing and there's no indication and nobody knows? But again, the focus at this particular time was it's not required in the code, so we're asking not to have that added on to help control costs and things like that. And then also, if the sprinklers work properly and save lives, all these additional things are going to eliminate the need for those other items anyway. And then other discussions and trade-ups that were looked at. Some of these were completed in Las Vegas. Some were recommended as for future developments. Consider allowing sprinklers to act as the equivalent to a certain level of rated construction and reduce the cost of rated separation. So within a home, you might have different code requirements for different rated walls, for example, between different areas, such as the garage and the rest of the home. If we put sprinklers in the home, can we look at reducing some of those requirements, say a 2-hour wall down to a 1-hour wall or something like that? So those were all looked at. Reduce separation between homes when all the homes are sprinklered. Now, this might be a concern in wildfire-prone areas where we don't necessarily want to reduce space between the homes when wildfire can act against that. So that all needs to be taken into account also, but in an area where wildfire is not a major concern, can we look at if all the homes in a new subdivision are sprinklered, can we reduce the distance between the homes a little bit, which will ultimately allow us to fit more homes throughout the subdivision. And then also consider reductions in water supply requirements. If all the homes are sprinklered, maybe we don't need as high of a fire flow requirement, for example. Maybe we can reduce the fire flow requirement down to the point, and in Las Vegas's case, they did reduce the fire flow down significantly to the point where maybe now we can allow for smaller water mains in the streets, for example, in a new subdivision, which always, anything you can reduce the size of or reduce helps to further control costs and offset any costs associated with the sprinklers. Look at slightly narrower streets. So Vegas ultimately did not go with the hydrant reduction, but as Gary mentioned, there are many times when the hydrant reduction can be looked at as a consideration. And so Vegas is left open. We will look at that in the future for certain areas of the city, as well as radius reductions in cul-de-sacs and hammerheads, longer dead ends in certain areas with fewer requirements for 2 points of access. Again, that's another one where you would have to look at the whole subdivision. Is it an area where it's prone to wildfires at all, and do we have to put that second point of access back in? But if wildfire is not a concern, maybe we can allow longer dead ends when all the new homes are sprinkled. They did allow sidewalks being eliminated on one side of the streets in new subdivisions, as well as eliminating street lighting in the newer subdivisions, with the lumens requirements being taken up by brighter lights on the homes themselves. Both of those items required also the involvement of the city's planning and city development divisions. And so again, with this overall collaborative approach, how do we bring others into the equation that have, you know, stakeholders, as we're always talking about, a stake in the final decisions being made, and work together to meet everybody's needs as the homes are being built. And then final steps, there were other process issues that needed to be addressed. Things like, how can we speed up the process? Again, the concern was by adding another system, the sprinklers in a home, it slows down overall construction. So how do we compensate for that? And so Vegas Fire was able to come around with quicker plan review process, permitting and inspection processes to help speed up all those things in exchange. All these additional steps and trade-off schemes, the HBA support. Once the HBA was on board and said, yes, we support all this, it was helping to control costs, it was helping the process, it was helping the timing issues, and all the other things that we talked about. At that point, they let the city council in Las Vegas know we support adoption of the residential sprinklers with all these various agreements in place, which was all written up, and that's what they ended up with. And as a result, this ordinance was written back into the code in 2019 as part of the overall city's adoption of the 2018 international codes at the time. And so since then, we're looking at about 5 years or so since then now. Over 11,000 new homes have been built in Las Vegas with residential sprinklers. Again, the city is continuing its fast growth. And the other cities around Las Vegas are now working on similar agreements because everybody all around the table is able to see the benefits of the entire agreement. And with that, I believe we're going to open it up to questions and answers from the audience.
That is correct. However, we want to start off with a question to our audience, and that is, would home fire sprinkler incentives appeal to you or to other stakeholders in your community when updating codes or building in areas where sprinklers are not required? So those of you who are attending this could just log in your feedback to us. We really do appreciate that. And while those responses roll in, I want to go ahead and take some of the questions that we've received so far. And for those of you who maybe are thinking of a question, go ahead and type that in into the control panel, little questions box, and you can get questions in like Sybil did. And so I'm going to start here asking some nuanced questions and some larger questions. First of all, when you have post and beam construction, how does the depth of the beam affect the design?
I'll take that. So again, that's part of the standard. There are installation requirements, and based on exactly that, the depth of the beam and the placement between that, the beam and the deflector of the sprinkler. Obviously beam construction is what we see a lot in new construction, and very easily to take care of that. It's part of the design. Again, remember, in most single family dwellings, you're talking about, you know, 1, maybe 2 sprinklers per room. Again, it's not like your typical office building or manufacturing or warehouse where you see rows and rows of sprinklers. On the residential side, it's expected that that only 1 or 2 sprinklers will be necessary in any one of a typical room.
Okay, I wanted to stick with you for a second, Gary, because there was a question that came up while you were talking, meaning while you were presenting. Is the design of the fire sprinkler system in a home, is it along the egress route? Is it only along the egress route? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's in every occupied space. So it's protecting the egress route, but it's not necessarily following an egress route. It's basically, again, you know, think of 1, maybe 2 sprinklers. You know, a very large living room, a family room, or a very large kitchen dining area may require a couple of sprinklers. I have in my kitchen, I have, you know, it's connected with a large eat-in area. I've got 2 sprinklers in sort of in the dining area, 1 sprinkler in the actual kitchen area. So in that total space, I only have sprinklers. But so the layout is following the room design, but you're protecting the integrity of the exit route.
Very good. Another one from Sybil, she was seeking clarification on something that was mentioned early on. The impression was that there's only 2 sprinklers for a 200-gallon tank, or were you referring to 2 sprinklers per room? Can you talk a little bit about that and just give us some clarity?
Yep, sure. The 2 sprinklers are the design. So again, we see most fires controlled by 1 sprinkler, but so basically the 2 sprinkler head design is sort of a safety factor, if you will. So if you're flowing about 10 gallons per minute out of that, out of those 2 sprinklers from a design standpoint, and the flow requirement is 10 minutes, you need a couple hundred gallons.
Okay, very good. You mentioned increased hydrant spacing as one of the benefits. Is that also germane in California as well? Do they recognize the increased hydrant spacing?
I don't know the specific answer of what California is doing, but I don't know if Bob does.
I don't know if California allowed reduced hydrant space, or sorry, increased hydrant spacing or not.
Okay.
I suspect that did not get captured in the statewide code requirement, but my guess is, again, they had so many years of local adoptions that perhaps it was something that was discussed locally in a number of communities and still may be discussed locally as part of the developer incentive program, even though it's in the state code.
Question came in from Dan, and Lorraine, I know you have a hand in some educational elements of what your organization does. So Dan asks, is there any free training that plumbers can take to be able to install these systems? He says he actually ran an HFSC event and he didn't have the answer for this question, but there was a builder who was interested.
There is some training. Gary, you may actually know. I don't know if it's free training, but there is definitely some training for plumbers to be able to install sprinklers.
Yeah, the National Fire Sprinkler Association, which is one of 2 nationally based organizations that support the sprinkler industry across all different types of occupancies. There's the National Fire Sprinkler Association and the American Fire Sprinkler Association. Both of them, I do believe, have programs for plumbers, but the one I'm most familiar about is the one from NFSA. And again, they will provide some financial incentive toward that training if it's being done in conjunction with perhaps an improvement in the licensing requirements within the state that will allow plumbers to do residential sprinkler work. I'll give you an example. They did it at least 3 sessions that I'm aware of they did in Connecticut. In Connecticut, as part of their licensing, was setting up what's called a limited sprinkler license to allow plumbers to do sprinklers in 1- and 2-family dwellings. The idea being that, you know, that's a trade that's already in the single-family dwelling anyway. Why not let them have the ability to do sprinklers? If the plumber gets that training, then wants to go 3 families or more or get into commercial, then they've got to get the standard sprinkler license. But I know NFSA worked very closely with the State Plumbing Board in Connecticut to provide those training sessions aimed at plumbers, and it was very well attended.
So here's an interesting question from Damien. If a person uses their home for some sort of small business, how does that affect either the design of the system, or what does 13D have to say about that?
You know, I can't think of any business that would be run out of a single family that would require. I mean, they're not going to set up a machine shop or something that would have a fire loading beyond what would be in a single family dwelling. I mean, if they're, you know, have a law practice or, you know, something in marketing or you know, graphic design or something like that. I mean, you know, the types of things that I'm picturing that you could do, you know, out of a single family home, you know, the sprinkler system on a 13D standpoint should be able to handle that. I think the only issue is going to be in terms of licensing and perhaps some sort of insurance requirements, but from a fire protection standpoint, unless Bob thinks otherwise.
No, I think you're right there, Gary. It's basically a case of the home is classified as a single family home. Codes always go by occupancy type, and so a home is a home. Basically, it's a case of if you were doing something in the home that doesn't meet local regulations somehow, say something with flammable liquids, for example, or something like that. Now you're not necessarily falling in the realm of a single family home anymore. If it's some kind of operating business that requires a license and things like that, now maybe the fire department's going to want to come in and do an inspection and say, okay, well, you're not really falling within the scope of a single family home anymore. Maybe now we need to look at, is the home sprinklered to begin with? Do we need to require sprinklers? And then if we do require sprinklers, based on what you're doing here, is a 13D system going to be adequate, or do we need to bump it up to a higher rated system of some sort?
Okay. Going back to the training question, Mark chimed in that typically the installers have to be certified or trained by the manufacturer in order for them to purchase and install the system. He's citing Uponor as an example of a manufacturer that provides training. Are you able to either confirm or refute that?
I know Uponor does provide training on their PEX-based multi-purpose systems, and the training that I know that NFSA offers through the plumbing boards that I was talking about earlier, they were based on standalone systems. The residential sprinkler manufacturers themselves, the manufacturers of the actual sprinklers, work through the sprinkler associations on any outreach, relative to their specific products. So that would be offered again through either NFSA or AFSA.
Okay. Yeah, and I would just add and recommend to anybody looking at training requirements to be able to install these systems, definitely check with your state, your local fire department where the home is actually being built, as well as any manufacturer requirements for training, because really all three of those things are going to come into play. I wouldn't want to leave it at, for example, hey, as long as you completed the manufacturer's training, you're good to go. There might be additional requirements through the fire department, the building department, and or the state, depending on where the home is being built.
Okay. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question, and this is of Bob. You mentioned towards your end of your last slide there that you have other communities around and near Las Vegas that are looking to enact similar ordinances. Are you able to share where some of those communities are, or the names of those communities?
I know for sure City of Henderson and City of North Las Vegas are both looking at similar requirements. Basically, it was a case of once the new requirements and the new agreement basically was put in place in Las Vegas, everybody was able to see the benefit of it. The home builders liked it, the fire department liked it, the new homeowners liked it. And so it was one of these kind of win-win for everybody situations where now the same home builders were going to a neighboring city and did not necessarily have the same agreement in place yet. And so then that started spreading the word of, okay, can we talk to this city then, a neighboring city, about having the similar requirements so that the requirements through all the cities around Las Vegas are consistent and everybody's having a similar arrangement and everybody's seeing the same cost benefits and things like that. So I don't know for sure. The only part I know for sure is that they're still working on it. I don't know for sure if they're actually complete yet. I would have to do some checking on that.
And I guess I'll wrap up with this question, and that is, do you find in your advocacy work, and I'm asking all of you, that facet of consistency tends to resonate more with builders and developers?
I would jump in first and say, I believe so. I think, for a builder that's working in multiple jurisdictions, it's a lot easier to do it the same way in every place. So putting sprinklers in one and having the ability to do it the same way in other places makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think our discussion, I'm glad the question about plumbers came up, because I think that's a major solution to the issue of gaining greater acceptance in residential sprinklers, again, because that's the contractor that's already in there. You're not adding another contractor. I think most within the sprinkler industry will admit that the sprinkler industry is so focused. They've got so much work on occupancies other than single family dwellings, that to have the plumber step in and have the state's licensing treat them as residential sprinkler contractors, if you will, with that limited sprinkler license just for 1 and 2 family dwellings, I think we'd see again a higher rate of acceptance from the builders, the developers, the local jurisdictions, and ultimately the consumers.
And I would add, if you think about the name, code, and standard, that's kind of the whole point in the first place, is that there is a standard for everybody to meet. And of course, local requirements, local considerations always come into play. So absolutely it would be beneficial for everybody to have that standard across the board. And that's why we're always interested in hosting webinars like this, because it gives an opportunity to talk about, okay, how do we get to that level of standard across an area so that everybody's doing the same thing and looking at the same requirements and things like that.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions, so I want to thank Lorraine, Gary, and Bob for their insights today. Really do appreciate it. Thank you also to our audience for attending and asking those wonderful questions. And thank you once again to the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. We've got another webinar coming at you in 2 weeks. That's on Wednesday, September 25th. We will be welcoming back Shauna Mazingo. She will be providing an overview of the 2021 IECC for residential buildings and address where industry professionals and homeowners should focus for maximum energy cost savings. That seminar or webinar is going to start at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, our usual start time. So until next time, keep New Orleans in your thoughts, please. And please stay safe, stay healthy, and take care, everyone. So long.